Hi, I'm Bill Furlong, and along with my colleague Dr. Mary Crossan, we co-host our podcast, Question of Character, where we answer all of your questions around the Ivy Leader Character Framework. We are delighted you can join us today. Remember, if this is your first exposure to the Leader Character Framework, you might want to listen to the first 2 episodes in our podcast. It's kind of a Leader Character 101A and B. And that'll give you the basic foundations of the Ivy Leader Character Framework, and it'll make it easier for you to understand and to follow. So now I'd like to introduce you to my co-host. She's a distinguished university professor at Western University, teaching at the Ivy Business School. Her research has been widely published in the world's most prestigious journals, and she is the author of numerous books and cases, including Developing Leadership Character. She is Dr. Mary Crossan. Good day, Mary. How are you?
Great, Bill. Good to be here again.
Great to see you again, Mary. We'd also like to welcome today's special guest. She is a graduate of Eastern Michigan University, where she completed her Bachelor of Science degree in Exercise Science and Sports Medicine, while also competing in Division I NCAA golf. She's a graduate of Western University, where she's currently undertaking her PhD in kinesiology. She has authored or co-authored a number of papers and articles on leadership character, and she's the co-developer of the Virtuosity Character Development app. She also happens to be the daughter of my co-host. She is Corey Crossan. Hi, Corey. Welcome back.
Hi, it's good to be back.
It's great to have you back, Corey. Thanks for joining us today. So, today's episode is, what are the PABCs of character development? Now, you may recall in our episode 4, Can You Change Your Character? We had Corey as a guest. And there we talked about a question that we get all the time. Can you really change your character? And so Mary and Corey answered questions and talked about the differences between personality and character, the various obstacles to developing character and how to overcome them, and some of the key principles that are involved in changing character. We also talked about the linkages between context, character, and core beliefs. And Mary and I gave some personal examples of how we've changed some of the character dimensions in our own lives and the effect and impact that that's had on us. So after listening to episode 4, we hope that you became convinced that character can indeed change and that it's a worthwhile investment. And also a sense of a general approach and some of the principles that you can use to improve your leadership character and how to sustain and grow it. So today's episode, though, is a deeper dive when it comes to the development of leadership character. And that's why we have Corey here. We're going to talk about the science related to changing our habits and apply those to leadership character. And we're also going to take a look at the underlying anatomy of character, the PABCs. So for PABC, the P stands for physiology, the A for affect, the B for behaviour, and the C for cognition. And they all function independently, but they also work together to support behaviour change. Conventional leadership development tends to focus on behavior and cognition, and they overlook things like physiology and affect. And we think those are key to developing some of the leadership character dimensions like humility, humanity, temperance, and transcendence. Typically, when leaders take the leader character insight assessment, the scores that they typically have that are lowest are around things like humility, humanity, and temperance. And those often lead to many of the derailments that people experience in their careers. So we hope that by listening to this episode today, you'll get a better sense of self-awareness and also an understanding of how you can change your habits. And also be able to develop and grow your leadership character with the least amount of effort expended. And that will lead to improved judgment, which will lead to better outcomes, which will lead to better well-being. So Corey, again, welcome back.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
So just before we start to get into some of the questions, I might ask Corey to maybe review some of the key learnings that we had in episode 4, Can You Change Your Character? So Corey, the first thing that we'd, maybe a quick review of some of the things we talked about in the last episode. What are the habit building principles to enhance the likelihood of habit development?
Yeah, so there are a handful of things that we can do to enhance the likelihood that we develop our character. And the first of that is that we have to have intent to develop character. And typically what's connected to intent is the belief or knowledge that what we're about to do is important. Then when we have that intent, we want to ensure that the behaviors that we want to change are achievable. So can we actually change those behaviors, coupled by a high motivation to change those behaviors? And a cool little strategy that we can use to enhance likelihood of habit development is making sure that we do that new behavior every single day. So the higher frequency that we actually do those behaviors, the more likely the habit is to develop. And attaching those behaviors to an already existing habit will also enhance the likelihood that we actually do those. So if you want to enhance your flexibility, stretching, for example, a very simple example, maybe attach it to your morning coffee routine. Then we get into a little bit more of the complex principles. So we want to make sure that we are continually making time to reflect on our behaviors so that we are aware of our behaviors. And this will allow us to create plans for what we want to actually focus on developing. And creating these plans is really important to make sure that we're creating customized plans exactly for our life and what we need to focus on developing. So spending that time to create those solid plans to stick to. And then the last piece is the accountability piece. So making sure that we hold ourselves accountable. And one of the best ways to do that is having an accountability partner or buddy. So checking in with our buddy to make sure that we're actually doing the behaviors that we've planned to do. And also having that buddy allows for enhanced learning by having that dialogue with the other person. So the more you talk about your experiences, the better you're going to be reflecting and aware of those behaviors that you're developing.
So really what you're talking about is principles that almost that guide the process that you would follow. And the result of that is that you'll end up developing character and the habits that you want to develop with far less in the way of effort. In other words, it'll be a far more efficient process if you follow these principles that you've outlined.
Yeah, and actually, you kind of bring up a good point there too that I forgot to add is the more you do these exercise these principles, the easier it does become. It's kind of like a virtuous cycle. So the more you do these principles, the more likely and the easier it gets to continue doing these things.
Perfect. So it's to me, it's the whole idea of working smart as opposed to working hard.
Mm-hmm.
So then, Corey, the next question would be is then when you're developing character, what are you really developing?
So character is essentially a habit of being. So what we're developing are habits. So that's what I just went over, are how do you develop a habit, a behavioral habit. And character is made up specifically of virtuous behaviors. So we're really developing a set of virtuous behaviors. And what we have found is that each of these character behaviors, the anatomy of character can be broken up into these PABCs: physiology, affect, behavior, cognition. So we want to make sure that we're really focusing on developing each of those PABCs to make sure that we're developing character to the best of our ability.
Right. Okay. So that might be a good opportunity then, or a good segue into describing and discussing each one of the PABCs and how each one is developed. So maybe let's start with physiology. Can you maybe provide us with a definition and a bit of understanding for our listeners as to what that is?
Yeah, and I'm just going to start off by saying this is quite a loaded area. So if I skip over anything, Mary, feel free to jump in because this is quite a complex topic. So yeah, I'll start off with physiology. So physiology, the basic kind of description of physiology, is the science concerned with vital processes in the body. So it really reveals how the body works in an integrated network. Yeah, that's kind of the basic definition of it. And I think the easiest way to think about it is, or an example of it is a fight or flight response. So how does your body just naturally react in a high stressful situation? And that's really what your physiology is.
Bill, I think a great maybe way to think about this is physiology. As you talked about at the outset, we really don't think about that often in development, leadership development. Yet that base level that Corey talked about, fight, flight, the kind of thing that you'd be thinking about is developing breathing to be able to deal with the heart rate variability that underpins things like fight and flight. So learning to breathe better is something that would be available to all of us, affects the physiological response of heart rate variability, and that directly affects things like temperance, your ability to be patient and calm, for example.
Right.
So that sort of hardwired response we have, that fight or flight, there's ways that we can train ourselves such that we're not left to some sort of intuitive instinctual reaction. And instead, we're creating what you've talked about in the past, Mary, this separation between stimulus and response. And so we can actually make more of a decision as to the response we make, as opposed to some sort of instinctive reaction. So do we want to talk a little bit about how you develop that? Mary's talked about briefly, the idea of around breathing. And are there other ways that people typically choose to develop it?
I think one of the other big major ways that people develop it is through mindfulness. So it's really bringing an awareness to what is going on with your body, what is going on with your breathing, what's going on with your heart rate, bringing an awareness there, and then being able to work on each of those systems because of the awareness that you bring to those systems.
And how would you say mindfulness is different than meditation? Is it really more something that you achieve mindfulness through meditation?
I think you can be mindful from doing, whatever it is that you're doing, whereas meditation is something that can come from mindfulness. So I think it's the other way around. Meditation is a certain state that you can achieve from being mindful of things, whereas mindfulness you can do every second of every day, when you're going out for a walk, when you're getting ready for work, when you're eating lunch, whatever it is you're doing. The more mindful you can be every second of every day, the better.
So then there's ways then that essentially, it sounds like a lot of it would be, is if you can be mindful and aware of yourself at all times, create that habit. If you've created habits that allow you to control your breathing, then that will actually allow you to gain more control over your physiology. You'll have developed a certain degree of control over your physiology that will create then that space that Mary was talking about before between stimulus and response. Have I got that right?
You have that right. I think I would add that where mindfulness sounds very cognitive, the focus here is on, as Corey talked about, being mindful of your physiology. So there's a lot of things we can be mindful of. We can be grateful to other people. There's a lot of mindfulness about, as Corey said, lots of things. What we want to focus on with this kind of training is being mindful of the fact that your heart rate might be increasing, for example. A lot of people don't really have a lot of body awareness. And so these are things like, even have yourself, monitor your pulse and think about what you think it is, then check your pulse rate so that you begin to become familiar with what's going on in your body. And Bill, this will become important as we start to talk about the connection between the PABCs, because a lot of times we're actually not aware of what's happening in our physiology, and then we mislabel it. So the mindfulness here is helping us learn about our own physiology.
Perfect. So I do recall actually a paper, Mary, of several years ago that there was a correlation between traders' profitability and their capacity to estimate their heart rate. In other words, the more mindful that the traders were, the more profitable they tended to be over the long term. I'll see if I can actually find that paper and attach it as a link to this podcast.
And Bill, things like yoga, which is something I spend time in, hot yoga in particular, what's really interesting is that when you're stressing your physiology, but also working on breathing with it to keep in that is a way to still your mind, right? So that there are practices that really focus on the physiology of things. Some runners would experience it, but it doesn't necessarily come with running. Because if you spend your time going through your to-do list in running, you don't allow your physiology to do some work for you, which is you just becoming in touch. And you would also want to be careful of things like where you learn to dull pain. There's a lot of athletes now, and Corey could talk about this from the kinesiology standpoint, is that it actually is operating like a vice, your physiology, because You need to work through pain. You need to dull pain. You need to not feel pain. And therefore, you lose a sense of contact with your physiology. In our case, we're saying, no, we want to increase that contact with physiology. We need to understand it. We need to be really self-aware of our physiology.
Great. So let's then move on to the A, the affect, which I guess, Corey, is around emotions. Can you fill us in on that, please?
Yeah, so affect is really about the feelings, mood, and emotions. And we can think about it as energy in motion. So it's really about being aware of our emotional response, which is especially critical for performance. We need to be aware of how we're responding to things moment to moment to ensure that what we are doing, especially cognitively, the decisions that we make, we need to be aware if they're being influenced by our emotional response. So if we aren't, I think a lot of people think that emotions are bad and it's better to suppress them. But if we aren't aware of what is influencing our decision making, then we aren't likely to be making the best decisions possible. So we need to be aware, of those emotions and process them effectively. We don't need to let them control our thinking, but we need to be aware of them so that they don't influence our thinking without us being aware of that.
So there's a couple of thoughts there then. One is so there seems like there's a mindfulness element there as well. And that my understanding is emotions, and this may sound too obvious, but they go from the positive emotions to the negative emotions, and that they're really triggered by an external stimuli, and that it's how that external stimuli triggers you is then that precipitates these either positive and negative emotions. So we need to be mindful, understand that there's an emotion coursing through us, understand if it's positive and negative, and then understand, how that's affecting maybe our decision making. Is that the span of what we need to be aware of when we talk about the affect?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to summarize it. I don't know, Mary, do you have anything else to add to that?
We'll pick this up again on the when you start to look at the relationship between something like cognition and affect, because part of our problems come in where we start to mislabel, which is what I was getting at before. So you run into a situation, you don't actually realize that your heart rate is increasing. You start to feel anxious, and you then quickly start to label. We're really good at trying to label, but we're very bad at labeling. We really often mislabel what's going on. So the anxiousness might actually come from a more positive place where you're excited about something, but you because you might have this nervousness and anxiety about it, you misread the fact that you're actually really excited about what's to happen. And if you were actually to come in at it in a more positive space, you wouldn't have feelings of fear, for example, stepping in and then starting to work back on your cognition, like, I really don't like what's going on here. So we begin to start to see these connections between these areas. So the piece I would like to focus on is the very fact of the labeling of the emotion that we have is a major problem for a lot of people.
And I understand, I think I've read in a paper that one of the papers that I think you and Corey have written is that there's the idea that to the extent you can actually control your emotions, and I'm not quite sure if that actually means taking a positive one, turning it into a negative, or vice versa, but to the extent you can control them, it actually leads to a higher sense of well-being. So are we really controlling them, or are we just understanding them and then not letting them overrule our judgment?
I really like this piece because I think the term control, while it can be an accurate term, using that term worries me sometimes, because I think people misinterpret it to think that they actually can fully control emotion. So if they're feeling angry, they can immediately say, I'm not angry, but that's really just suppressing it. So the term I like to use is just processing emotions effectively. So like what you said, it begins with the understanding and acceptance that you have that emotion so that you can quickly work through that emotion. So process it and understand how it's affecting your decision making. It's everyone naturally experiences emotions. So to say that you can fully control them, I don't think is the best term, but yeah, more so making sure that you're processing those effectively.
And Bill, the link between character here becomes important around, Corey and I have both talked about one of our uh, thorns in our side is around justice. So I would say we both have justice operating like a vice, not supported enough by the humanity to go along with it, because you start to see injustices that get you angry, right? I think we can all relate to that, particularly in this period of time. The humanity side of things, though, allows you, when it's developed, is to understand what is going on and why is it occurring. Temperance, to give you the patience and calm so that you have the judgment to make the choice as to, is this the time to step into this problem, or is there a better time to deal with this? And where you find yourself, that anger welling up, many of us lose our choice because we simply become angry, we lash out, maybe regret the words that we have to say. I think things like humility as well, because sometimes that anger, in the case I just gave, could be about injustices, but sometimes it's about bruising our ego, right? We get frustrated, angry, hurt. But if we ask ourselves, what's the source for where this negative emotion is coming from? And is it my pride getting in the way here? Is it my, lack of humanity that's getting in the way? Is it my attachment around drive to the expectations about what should have happened and when it should have happened? There's a lot of things that you can quickly do a gut check around the character dimensions to ask yourself what might be going on here with this energy that's in motion. And then, as Corey talked about, that this capacity then to process those emotions from the negative state, and not, it doesn't mean that if there's an injustice that's done that has made you angry that you're not going to do something about it. But how do you actually process that to a state of positivity that enables you to have clarity, have choice about what that's done? And if we tie that back to the physiology aspect, breathing, for example, is an incredible way. It's like an air filter for emotions that can allow us to work through really toxic and negative emotions and process them, as Corey described.
I was just going to add in one point, just touching on the negative and positive emotion. I think although we'd rather be in that positive emotion area, it's also important to note that we are in that positive emotion area, because that will also influence our decisions and it may compromise our ability to make decisions. So we're typically, I would say, think about it operating at a neutral level. And anytime we deviate from neutral, we're experiencing emotion, whether that's positive or negative. And I think a really concrete example of that is if you're feeling really happy and excited about something and you make a deal or a plan moving forward, that actually may not be something that you want to stick to moving forward, because you're very positively deviated from that neutral point. So although positive emotion is a better place for us to be in, we also need to identify that because it will influence our decision making.
So that's a great point, Corey. I'm really glad you raised that. And it kind of goes back to what you said at the very beginning, is that historically people have looked at emotions. Let's get emotions out of the decision-making framework. Don't be acting emotionally. But I think the point we're trying to make is, well, actually, we're human beings. We can't actually get the emotions out of it. What we need to do is actually process the emotion, be aware of the emotions, and then once that's done, you can then move into the judgments and decisions and actions and behaviors that you want to take.
And Bill, to think about things like transcendence and things like passion, humanity, compassion, empathy, these are dimensions of character that require emotion. I think it's the most foolish position for people to be thinking about is extracting affect, emotion out of decision making, because it's not just that we're human beings, it is actually the ingredient for absolutely superior performance and superior judgment and decision making around things. I think it's just as Corey talked about, though, whether it's really positively deviant or negatively deviant, is to understand how it might be affecting your decision. And it might be affecting your decision in a really important way, because that passion that you bring to something could be the very thing that you need at that point in time.
Perfect. Okay, good. And again, this is often overlooked, I think, in leadership training, the practicing and building the habits around affect. But now we come to behavior, and behavior is talked about all the time, I think, in leadership training. And again, my understanding around behavior, Corey, is that it's sort of this linchpin between the internal and external worlds that we live in. Can you give us a little bit of background around behavior and how you understand it in this context?
Yeah, so behavior is just movement itself. And I think it's such an important piece because it's how others understand what we're thinking, what's going on internally, and it's how we perceive others and understand others. So it is really important to ensure that we are aware of our P, A, and C's so that we can accurately portray what we're thinking through our behavior so other people understand us to the best of our ability. And I think the theme that we've been talking about continually today is reacting versus creating this habit that gives us time to think between stimulus and response. And unfortunately, a lot of our behaviors, if we reflect on even just today, most of our behaviors typically are reactionary. So it's really focusing on how can we ensure that our behavior is thoughtful and we're creating that time to behave how we want to behave.
Now, early in the answer that you provided there was the idea of this sort of one-way direction of behavior. You experience some sort of an emotion, maybe some cognition, and then that results in behavior. But my understanding is it actually works in reverse. In other words, you can actually hold your body in a certain way, feeling that's opposed, that feels confident, and you hold it that way for 30 seconds or a minute, and you'll actually start to feel confident. And so does behavior actually work both ways in that sense? It can actually influence affect and physiology too?
Definitely, yeah. So, and that is another important point, looking at all these PABCs in isolation, is you can develop and work on each of those in isolation, and then they will enhance and be connected to the other ones. And so, yeah, just like the example you provided, there's so many examples of how you can work on your behavior to enhance those other P, A, and C. So, I mean, the other example that we all know is if you just fake a smile for a little bit, it enacts all these sequencing of physiological responses that actually start to make you happier and more positive. And then another study that we've read is just free movement. So dancing, moving around freely actually starts to trigger more free flexibility of thinking cognitively. So yeah, there's all these things that you can do behaviorally first that enact a sequencing after that.
Perfect. So, and then the last one I think is cognition, which I think is so much the focus of our lives, from the time we go to school to university, the kinds of training that we get. Can you talk a little bit about thinking, and in particular, if you can focus on the idea of a fixed versus a growth mindset?
Yeah, so the cognitive piece is really about the thinking, learning, and memory piece. And a big focus on the cognitive development is thinking about, yeah, like you said, the fixed or growth mindset. So the fixed mindset really has this concept behind it that there isn't much learning that can be done. The abilities that you have are the abilities that you'll have forever, and whatever you're capable of now is all you'll be capable of. Whereas the growth mindset is more so thinking, really looking at every single opportunity as a learning experience and thinking about how you can improve whatever process you're trying to work on. It is a complex idea. So Mary, do you have anything to add to that?
We can put some resources. Carol Dweck is, of course, the world expert on fixed and growth mindsets. I think it's something that a lot of people think about. They haven't really thought about the fact, though, that it can relate to character, and that our view would be is that if you're developing strength of character, you can move yourself from a fixed to a growth mindset. and that the impediments to learning that would arise from a fixed mindset are often really character related in their orientation. I would add one other area beyond fixed and growth mindsets, which is a nice way to bucket our core beliefs. There are many, many core beliefs that we have. The interesting thing, and you're going to hear a lot in this theme today, is we have a lot of things operating at a more subconscious and conscious level, as which our core beliefs do. And they could be really core beliefs that become dysfunctional for us. I can't trust anybody. Nobody loves me. I can never do enough. There is this kind of sense for a lot of people plagued by these sets of core beliefs, which are big cognitive scripts that guide our behaviors and really have us filtering things like our emotions. So the moment we talked earlier about, all right, we've got energy and emotion, and then I pick it up and I start to label it relative to the script that I already have running in my mind. So the kinds of things that Corey talked about, fixed and growth mindset, of course, they flourish into all of these core beliefs that are these scripts by which we run our lives every day. I think for our listeners, the way I like to think about this is that your core beliefs tend to be dysfunctional when they operate always in a particular way. Because if we then relate it back to character, judgment tells us, I can't trust everybody, and I can't, not trust everybody. My judgment helps me understand who I can trust and when I can trust them. And so I think that we pick up with things like our core beliefs when they become really rigid in their orientation and a sense that they always operate in a particular way. It's a good place to ask ourselves, what's going on with our character? Would we, if we began to think about strengthening humility or humanity or courage or transcendence, would it shift those core beliefs?
Right. And I recall from episode 4 as well, I think you, Mary, and perhaps Corey as well, talked about another indication of when a core belief is dysfunctional is when it creates negative emotions. And I think both of those ways of being mindful and reflective can be very helpful in surfacing what are otherwise difficult to discern core beliefs, because as you say before, they're sort of this operating script and they tend to work below the surface. So perhaps then we can turn to, how do the PABCs actually work together? And we've had a couple of examples of that already. And maybe, Corey, if you can give us a sense of that, how they work together, and maybe, what happens when one subsystem, one element is weaker or stronger than the others.
Yeah, so it's funny that the integrated nature of it just came out as we were trying to talk about each independently, because they are so integrated. It's hard to talk about them not integrated. And the most important thing to think about these is that if there is one weakness in any of those systems, it's going to significantly inhibit the development of any of those other systems and ultimately compromise your performance. And inability to develop character is the main thing that we're talking about today. And so maybe what we'll talk about is just what the PABCs look like in coherence. And when we have the PABCs in coherence, we ultimately support our thinking and decision making. And so other tangible little pieces that we can look at from a PABC coherence are looking at we get improved hormone balance, cardiac health, immune systems, emotional balance, faster reaction time. So those are all like the little bits that support ultimately our thinking and decision making. And yeah, I think a very obvious example that reveals what a weakness in one of those systems and how that compromises performance is looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as an example. So obviously with PTSD, there are changes in the psychological responses, and that individual can't temper their psychological responses to stress anymore. And I guess as I'm talking through this example with PTSD, for anyone listening, you can think about any type of situation that you've been in. It can be any situation that's caused you stress or anxiety. And when you're then placed in that situation again, you start to experience symptoms right away. And that's your physiology reacting to that situation, saying, hey, I'm here again. It didn't feel good last time. And so your body starts reacting to kind of protect you. But that's your body acting physiologically, responding because you haven't processed that past experience before. And then that's obviously at a very high level going to inhibit your ability to think clearly and behave how you'd like to in that situation.
So there's all kinds of examples of that, not just PTSD, but we talked a little bit last week, in one of the episodes previously, about public speaking and how so many people, and myself included historically, where before you get up to give a speech or a presentation, so many people have these physiological reactions. So that's, and was really what you said before, was that just one of those four elements, to the extent that one of them is weak, it substantially or significantly weakens all the others. How do you sort of diagnose that without sort of professional help? And is there something, and I'm not quite sure, and then how do you overcome it? I think there was something I talked or read about in terms of cardio coherence training. I don't know if that's something that can help you, but how do you sort of figure out which system it is the culprit that you need to sort of work on as a priority?
Well, I think a really good starting point is thinking about, well, what do you spend the most time thinking about, or what do you value the most? That's probably a really quick, easy way to troubleshoot what you should be focusing on. And I think also identifying, if you've been listening to any of these things and you say, oh, that doesn't matter, well, it's probably one of your weakest areas if you don't care about it. And that's back to one of my earliest points about in the principles, having the intent to develop those things, or the belief or knowledge that is important. So if you're listening to any one of these things and you're thinking, oh, it's not super important, it's probably one of those areas that you should start thinking about a little bit more.
So let's give an example of a person that really struggles with speaking in public and presentations, and they get that classic sort of, the heart rate goes up and the breathing becomes shallow. For that kind of a person, I know everyone's different, but so would they be a person that thinks to themselves, I need to think more about physiology. I need to understand my breathing more. I need to be more cognizant and aware of my heart rate. Is that where they would go, or is every single person different? Or can you just sort of draw from that example what you just said?
I think what we're losing maybe a little bit in the conversation here is the connection to character. Because if you start with, so why did my heart rate increase? What was it that was going on? You might find that looking at things like humility as an example, you realize that you're worrying about what people think about you. And you actually, if that piece were resolved, it may not be affecting your heart rate at all. You actually don't experience that heart rate going up. So what we want to do with these kinds of things is play back and forth between the dimensions of character and an awareness about what's going on. So you just as I was talking about with things like justice and humanity and humility, as it would have deal with emotions and the affect side of things, is the same thing happens with your physiology. So the beauty is you begin to notice that your heart rate is changing. You begin to notice that something is going on. You begin to notice that you're labeling it in a particular way. But why did you label it that way? So you become an observer of yourself as to what's happening, and using the dimensions of character as a roadmap that help you kind of navigate. Oh, I wonder if this has to do with my collaboration or my drive or my transcendence, and it allows you to work through that way. Corey, is that how you would see it as well?
Yeah, I think that's a great point of just tying it back to character and how those are really tied together. And I think to bring it back down to just the PABCs, also looking at them as just tools that you can use to enhance the other systems. So when I think about public speaking, for example, and if my heart rate's going up and whatnot, I can be aware that my heart rate's going up, but perhaps the best way for me to actually develop my physiology is trying to play with the other systems. So maybe saying positive statements in my head. So looking at targeting the cognitive piece, or trying to remember positive things and trying to target the affect side so that it will develop the physiology. So even though it may be your physiology that's weak, you can also develop those other systems to enhance that specific system. So I think it's a little bit of a trial and error, and being open-minded. So again, like that character piece, open-minded to try and play with those different systems, and I think importantly value all of those systems and understand how they do relate to your character development.
One of the terms that I'd come across, Mary, in some of the readings I had done was something called cardiac coherence training. That sounded interesting. Was there an application here to the development of character?
Yeah, definitely. So Alan Watkins, their nice TED talk about being brilliant every day, talks about heart rate variability as what we need to focus on. So it's not that you have a high heart rate or a low heart rate, but it is the variability of the heart rate. So, whether or not it's fluctuating around a particular norm or it's spiking and deviating. And when we're under stress, we find it spiking and deviating. And what he would talk about is that coherence training would be around breathing, back to the things we talked about, having an equal amount of breaths in and an equal amount of breaths out, that very activity itself brings the heart rate variability down to a more normal rate. And it's at that normal rate that we can now find ourselves in a better cognitive space, a better affect space. So that is a really particularly important one. So it gets us back to breathing again.
Right. And then I think something else that I'd read as well in a paper that I believe is under review is the importance of positive emotions and how they sort of seem to run through all of this whole PABC network, to the point, I think, that it's almost like you'd never want to have a negative thought, or you'd never want to sort of think negatively. Is there something to that? Is there something you could maybe add to that, either Corey or Mary?
Yeah, I think that positive emotion significantly does enhance your ability to cognitively perform. So there's a very good, clear connection there. But I do think that it's important to identify the difference between positive, negative emotion, and then compared to pessimism and optimism. And I think so. Optimism is a character behavior that we have in the character framework, and the more we can be optimistic, the better. But I think, and the more optimistic we are, I think we are more likely to have positive emotion. But I think it's also important that if we do have negative emotion to something, like something bad might happen, that identifying a negative emotion and being like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't be having this, and suppressing it is, again, kind of like falling into that trap of controlling emotion, or just kind of like freaking out about it. I think inevitably we're all going to have some negative emotion, so just being comfortable with that and processing it. But again, the more we can develop our optimism, it will really, I think, enhance and flourish more positive emotion, which is cyclical into optimism, positive emotion, that kind of thing.
Okay, great.
So some good supporting work would be Fredrickson's work on the broaden and build theory of positive emotions. So the thing is she really writes a lot that tries to counteract this view that emotions are problematic to decision making, and provides lots of evidence on its importance. And as Corey talked about, though, we have to be mindful that even something like optimism, in the case of transcendence, it needs other facets of character in order to make sure that optimism doesn't operate like a vice, or those positive emotions that may be overwhelming us and having us take on things that we shouldn't. Right? It's all of this around character has us understanding that these systems work together, and we've got access points on how to think about how they're working to enhance our judgment and decision making.
So we've got this now basic understanding, the framework of the different components, the PABCs, and that they work together. I think we can appreciate that it's quite complex. It involves the biological processes and systems inside of us, our cognition, our emotions. With all of that, how do we then use this understanding to incorporate that into the changes that we want to make in developing a various habit or a dimension inside of the leader character framework? Corey, any thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think I'll kind of like step back and take like a broader view for a little bit, and then we can dive in, bring it back to the PABCs. So just a reminder here that when we're talking about building a habit, we're talking about behavioral habits. So these are behavioral as opposed to neuro habits that there's typically a lot of discussion around. And so focusing on those behavioral habits, if we go back all the way to the work of Aristotle, he talks about these virtuous habits need to be practiced. So he gives the example, just as a pianist practices the piano more and more and more to become better, we need to do the same thing with these habits. They need to be practiced to be developed. And so when we practice those, though, before we practice those, we also need to, before that, we need to have learning, a learning part. So with learning, there's typically a cognitive piece and a behavioral piece. And actually, I'll hand it over to you, Mary, because I think you have a cognitive behavioral concept that you've worked on before.
Sure. In the work I have done on organizational learning, one of the things that we tried to talk about is that the integrated learning is both cognitive and behavioral in its orientation. So I'll leave the P and the A out, because when I developed this model, we weren't actually thinking about the P and the A. The problem with a lot of learning that happens in the workplace and otherwise, it's the effort is around changing cognition in the hopes that will change behavior. So we called that anticipatory learning. However, what we do know with things like cognitive dissonance and balance theory is that we can't hold our cognition and our behavior out of balance for long periods of time. So they will resort back to a belief. So you may start with this idea that, well, yes, I can do this, and I think this is important, and this is, I've learned this to be a really critical piece of something. Then over a period of time, if you can't put that behavior in place, you resort back to the original learning. So we've often talked about that as block learning. Well, what was it that got in the way? But we never think about that. What's the obstacle that prevented you from moving forward? So I'm going to take you to another side, which is, well, what if you led with behavioral change, experimented with behavior, and that you experiment with that behavior? So things like improv training and things that we might do, music training, is that you experiment with the behavioral change and find that your cognition follows. So these are the situations where after the fact we go, wow, I didn't really think I was going to get a lot out of that. And then all of a sudden you go, but boy, was that an impactful learning experience. That's likely where you put yourself in an experimental state, tried on the behavior, didn't judge it in the process of doing it, and then allowed yourself to learn. Now, there's a flip side of that leading with behavioral change. If you find yourself in a forced learning mode, either you believe that you're in that mode, like somebody's making me do this, or that you just yourself feeling forced, you haven't allowed yourself to engage in the play of what it is that you're about to do, you end up finding yourself reverting into this, no learning quadrant, back to this space where, okay, I tried out the behavior for a short period of time, but nothing happened. And therefore, a lot of people are really in that no learning state, right? Not a lot of change in cognition or behavior. We can get temporary change in cognition or behavior, but what we want to have here is sustained change, that integrated learning.
So Mary, when you talk about an approach which starts with behavioral change to drive cognition change, it also strikes me as well, though, is that starting with behavioral change might also make it easier to impact the physiology in the affect systems as well, leading to also further growth and development. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. And one of the reasons that occurs is that our cognitive structures can get pretty rigid, and we often don't know how rigid they are. Therefore, when they're trying, to change behavior or affect, we get so hardwired around the way we think about things that it's really hard to rely on those other systems. So the behavior change gets us out of our comfort zones typically, because the comfort zone tends to be often a cognitive comfort zone. So if you start in a place where you're not cognitively comfortable, and you allow yourself to be more in a play state where you can experiment with it, you allow those other systems, I would call it, you kind of quiet your cognitive system, and those other systems can come into play a little bit more.
And that's why I think, Mary, in the programs that you teach around character development, there are some less conventional methods that you use. So, for example, meditation and improv. And I think one you use is also is music. Could you talk a little bit about how music is used as a development methodology?
Yeah, music, it turns out to be a stunning way to look on the activation of character. So Cassie Ellis, who is a postdoc who works with us and has co-written with Corey and I, she comes out of a PhD where her PhD thesis in kinesiology looked at music and its effects on a variety of factors. So when I teamed up with Cassie, it was really helpful to take her expertise around how does music operate, like what's the science of music, and then we worked to understand, well, why would that scientific basis of music help us in thinking about the activation of character. We've written a piece, the three of us, looking at how it works through the PABCs, because I guess most of us, without getting too scientific about it, can realize that music affects our emotions, right? Song can make us sad, it can make us happy. We know that music affects our physiology, it calms us down, it can get us energized about things. It will affect our cognition around, well, what does it get us to think about in terms of the nature of the music? It can bring us back to a time and a place about how we thought about something or experienced something. So what we do with the dimensions of character is have people look at what music activates the various dimensions of character for them. So what activates transcendence, what activates drive, humanity, humility, etc. Maybe, Corey, you could give an example about how you've experienced music that way.
Yeah, so there's so many ways that I can use music to develop character, but I actually have a very specific example of a significant character development experience I've had with music, and specifically looking at the PABCs. So after I finished my tenure as an NCAA athlete, I was actually experiencing quite high levels of anxiety and stress. And how that was affecting my PABCs is it was really stressing my physiology system. And therefore, my affective system was quite more on the negative side, and my cognition wasn't working that well. So just a lot of struggles within the PABCs. And I actually had this moment where I was doing a hot yoga power class, and at the end of the hot yoga power class, whoever was leading that class turned on the song Hallelujah, and it's quite a long song, and they asked us to just kind of relax and stay on the floor until that song was done. And as I was listening to that song, it really activated on my temperance, and really kind of brought this ease to my physiology system. It really calmed me for the first time. I hadn't experienced this like calm feeling in such a long time. And in that moment, I just hadn't experienced that temperance in a very long time. And what it made me realize is I didn't even know that I had temperance at that time. So it enabled me to discover a latent character behavior. And bringing that back to the character framework, when we look at character development, we have these different kind of stages to character development. So very early stages of character development are discovering those latent character behaviors. Everyone has those behaviors, even though you may forget or not know that you have them. And then you move to activating those on a more regular basis. So what I realized going back to my experience was when I heard that song again on the radio, maybe like 6 months later, I was almost immediately transported back to that yoga room, and it activated on that temperance again. And specifically also the physiology calming me down a little bit more. And then what I realized is I could actually just listen to that song whenever I wanted to. I didn't just have to wait to hear it on the radio. So I started listening to that song more often. So moving along that continuum, I started strengthening that temperance more. And then when we continue to move along that continuum, we can also connect our character behaviors to other character behaviors. So as I was able to strengthen that temperance behavior, I was actually able to strengthen and connect it to my humility that had also been quite weak, lacking self-awareness and reflection. And then being able to sustain that behavior over time is really where we look at the end of the character development continuum. So using that song, or even just thinking of that song, for me now activates on those character behaviors, and specifically calms my physiology system a little bit more.
That's a fantastic example, Corey. I mean, thank you so much for sharing that. And it starts to go back to the power of the leader character framework. In other words, it gives you this lens to look through and understand these experiences that you have. And then, the work that you're doing around the PABC networks and tying that in together, resulting in significant, substantial change and growth, increased well-being. I think it's all, again, that's a fantastic example of showing the power of the framework and how it can actually lead to these great improvements in our lives. In the absence of all of that, you'd just, you sort of muddle along and randomly trying different things. So thank you again for sharing that. I think the other thing that also shows too, Corey, is that you've got to be ready and prepared to take on some unconventional approaches. And I think one of the things you're doing something right when you're feeling a bit uncomfortable. When you're feeling outside of your comfort zone, you're in the right place. And I think that can be hard for people. But I think that's a marker to me of success, not of failure. So Corey, we've talked an awful lot now about how individual character development, how the PABC framework can be used in collaboration with the leader character framework to make these changes. What about group character development? How do you use the framework there?
Yeah, so group character development is definitely a really great way to look at group manifestations of character. So obviously a group is made up of individuals, so it's always still important to focus on individual character development, but it doesn't always mean that the sum of the parts will exactly, equal the character of the group. So there can be group manifestations of character, so it's also important to tackle group character development at the group level. And Mary, you've had a lot of experience doing group character sessions, so maybe you can talk about some of the experiences you've had or knowledge you have from that.
Yeah, I think the neat part about thinking about group character development are two really important angles. One is that we judge ourselves on our intention and others on their behavior. And there's this big gap, as we've talked about before, between intention and behavior. And experiencing and developing character in a group has those two colliding. Is that we see how others experience us. It's not simply me in isolation working at doing something, but I'm actually engaging in a group, and it's that interaction that helps me see. The other part, as we know, we've talked about before, we tend to not be very good at developing our self-awareness. So 85% of us believe we're self-aware, only 10 to 15% are. So the ability to collaborate and work in a group allows us this interaction and interplay. I would say also that the issues that people face in the context aren't simply about the challenge of, let's say, of going out in public speaking, which is an individual, going into a group context, but not necessarily interacting, is that many of us really are challenged by the interactivity of working with others, particularly others who are different than us. And things like the development of humility, humanity, and collaboration really start to uh, get some exercise in a group setting. And of course, there's many things that you could do in a group, things like improv, things like the music workshop. Those are things that you could all do in a group setting. I think that in the end, that the dimension, for example, of collaboration is a pretty hard one to develop in any other way, but trying to be collaborative. And there you find, well, what were the limits of that? This isn't just teamwork. It was, how come I lack this interconnectivity with others? What was going on there, etc. So those would be some of the key things that I would say about the group. With one more important point, I think people would want to ask themselves the question around their character, because we think about character contagion. To what degree do you bring positive character contagion to a group, negative character contagion to a group, or are you neutral? And in all possibility, every one of us could bring positive character contagion to the group. And that gets back to the point that Corey talked about, is that we're much greater than the sum of our parts. That we, with acting with character contagion, that we elevate the character of all of us in the process.
So one of the things that happens when you do enter into a group, and again, we're talking about some of these unconventional approaches, is that you're feeling uncomfortable. You're outside of your comfort zone, but that then is amplified by virtue of being in a larger group. So doing improv in a group, or doing a music session in a group, or doing a meditation in a group. That can be an obstacle because people may resist that and push it away. Whereas I think what's really important, and I think you've experienced this, is if one or two people can actually embrace it and take that positive energy and become those leaders, if you will, to that others can follow into that uncomfortable zone, where I think if you can cross that bridge, it becomes an extremely positive learning experience, a great opportunity, if you will.
And Bill, one of the things that we witness quite a bit is that in a group setting, the leadership isn't about somebody often, who's really good at doing something. It's actually the person who's vulnerable. And people witness that, because probably the most courageous thing to do is to be vulnerable. I read a story recently where this athletic leader was talking about depression and anxiety, and he was ridiculed by a sportscaster for showing that vulnerability. And how could he possibly lead if he showed that vulnerability? I love the fact that there were so many people that said it wasn't just the wrong thing to say, but, because it was politically incorrect or whatever, but actually that he had it dead wrong. That leadership was about vulnerability, and that was the characteristic lacking in many leaders. So I think, Bill, in a group setting, vulnerability, where you start to see people being vulnerable, that really is an inspiration to many others who fear it themselves.
In a previous episode, Mary, you've talked about how some of the dimensions are only seen in their negative state, things like humility and humanity. And I think vulnerability has been often seen in the negative state. And I think it's high time that we actually see it for the positive character that it really is. It truly is leadership at its finest.
I have no doubt a future episode will focus on it. We'll link in Brené Brown's work on vulnerability, understand how does it operate as a virtue, as a vice. It's such an important element of humility that it really deserves its own episode.
So, Corey, we've talked about the PABCs, how they connect together, how any one particular one, if there's a weakness in that, it can affect the others. We've talked about how leadership, character, and PABCs link, both in an individual setting and a group setting, and it can be quite complicated. But I also know that you're the co-developer of a virtuosity app around leadership character development. Have you taken into account these various principles and the knowledge that you have in that application? And can you maybe talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so almost everything that we've talked about today, everything actually that we've talked about today embedded into this virtuosity app. And I think sometimes, like, listening to a lot of this, there's a lot to think about, and it's hard to think about a plan and how to move forward. So this virtuosity app really does make it an easy guide to kind of like follow along and learn for yourself. So yeah, the virtuosity app, we have a whole library of exercises that you can use as a user that incorporates all of these principles and looks at all the PABCs. And it also has a library of content that kind of guides you through each of the dimensions and each of these complicated concepts in more depth. And of course, it has all of the habit development principles that we talked about at the beginning. So it will have you have an accountability partner. It has you doing exercises every single day. It has you reflecting on your exercises each day. So it has all of that all in one simple app.
Well, that's great, Corey. I think, again, the idea of working hard versus working smart, I think this application will allow people to work smartly towards the development of the leadership framework, of the leadership dimensions that they want to develop. And so thank you for pulling that together for us. So this episode, we've really talked about understanding the anatomy of character, the PABCs. And it has, I think, a lot of benefits for us in terms of understanding the process around leadership character development, enhancing our self-awareness so you can better understand your progress. You can diagnose and prescribe different courses of action for yourself as you go forward. You can make those adjustments that you need to make. What I also really have enjoyed today is talking about some of those areas that are typically missed in conventional leadership development. So the idea around physiology and affect, which are largely ignored, which are absolutely critical to the development of any habit. But our focus really is around the leadership character dimensions and how that can affect so many of the decisions and judgments that you make every single day. And it makes the character journey that we all want to take, I think, far easier with better results. And also this understanding and how it can be applied to different groups and impacting the culture of your organization. And can start to make these permanent, sustainable changes to the habits that we have. And the ones that will allow us to produce the best performance possible under the widest variety of circumstances. And that when we really need our leadership character dimensions, that they'll be there for us in those times of stress and difficulty. We are all collectively convinced that the leadership character framework and the development of those habits works and makes changes in people's lives. We've seen it, we've experienced it, and the impact that it has on your professional life, your personal life, and your well-being. And because we're convinced of it, that's why we're so passionate about the work. We've seen the power and potential of these ideas being put into practice. So thank you again for joining us today. If you've liked what you've heard and saw today, please share with your friends and your colleagues. If you really like what you've heard and seen today, then please subscribe to our podcast, Question of Character. We also have a website, questionofcharacter.com, where we will be posting various resources and articles, and in particular, any links to today's shows in terms of diagrams, schematics, or other items referred to in today's podcast. It's also a place where you can send us your comments, your thoughts on what you've heard, and suggestions perhaps for future podcasts. We'll also post links to the Ian O. Ina Towitz Institute for Leadership at the Ivey Business School, where there are even more resources, articles, and information about the Ivey Leader Character Framework. So thank you again, and it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Until next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.